Pat McDowell, welcome to this year's Nonprofit Productivity Summit. Really excited to have you on for this year for a whole host of reasons. You're a podcaster, you're an author, one of my favorite nonprofit books, Your Path to Nonprofit Leadership, and you run a very successful consulting firm. You've done so many things in the nonprofit space, very accomplished fundraiser, and now you're helping other people to be even more healthy in their nonprofit roles. So welcome to the summit. And is there anything you'd like to add to that introduction?
No, Mike, grateful for the opportunity and delighted to partner with you on these topics, which hopefully will help those in our respective spaces.
Well, when I was on your podcast, which seems like a long time ago now, I definitely sensed a kinship that you and I have for both the nonprofit work that we do, but also for trying to work smarter and trying to be as productive as we can be without giving into kind of toxic productivity and all that. So I want to start by looking at your weekly process as you get ready for a week. And I remember years ago, I was talking to a couple of relatives of mine. One was in software and one was in finance. And I said, okay, guys, how do you prepare for a week? And they both looked at me as if I was, I don't know, speaking different language. And they said, what do you mean? We just show up on Monday. And I think at the time I was running a school and I said, well, I can't do that. I need to take a few hours on a Sunday to just kind of get my mind right so I know what I'm doing and then just sort of, wind it up and let it go. Let's get the sense from you. How do you prepare for a work week?
Well, of course, you and I are both fans of David Allen, and so I have to give him credit in the GTD, getting things done model of a weekly review has been transformative for me, literally, because I think I've gotten better at the skill and the kind of techniques around it. What I've found, though, Mike, recently or in recent years, there are two distinct elements I like to use as a weekly review kind of ritual. Usually on a Saturday morning, I will do what is a reflective exercise, looking intentionally at the week behind me. And the first thing I'll do is a journaling exercise, which is more free form, just a chance to, and I'm just a big fan of journaling in general for the therapeutic value, as well as the tactical note-taking capabilities. But I start with a general prompt to myself. All right, what are you feeling right now? Let's talk about, what the last week represented, frustrations, exciting things, ideas, and I just kind of free flow for a page or two. Then I move into a more tactical weekly review, and I literally go down the last 7 days calendar. And invariably, Mike, I find things I forget. So in other words, I force myself in the journal to go, let's start Monday morning. All right, I met with Mike that morning. All right, what needs to happen next there? What could be an opportunity for additional collaboration? Did I promise to send them something? And again, I usually end up with a page full of notes as a result of going through the calendar, because every meeting likely inspires something else, an idea, an activity, a to-do list item. And so for me, instead of getting ahead, which again, my downfall perhaps historically was it's too easy to look at next week, forgetting that I have not closed all the loops on the previous week. So ritual part one is reviewing the week behind, both the kind of broader sense of note-taking and journaling, but then also the tactical review of every item. So I guess I wonder if that makes sense to you, but that at least is part one of mine.
That's perfect. So two follow-ups. One, are you handwriting or are you using an app? And then second, do you do anything to kind of set the mood or the environment so that you're getting in the right headspace for that weekly review?
Love the questions. The journaling is, of course, handwritten. I use a Moleskine. That is my trusty. I've got a whole shelf full of them now that I've kind of kept these notes and use that element. But to your point, I go to a coffee shop. I have found that my Saturday morning ritual literally is a go to a coffee shop, quiet, early morning, where I do think there's something about getting out of kind of your current home office, whatever, And for me is exactly that. Now, the to-do list items, which is something else we'll talk about, I then translate into my OmniFocus, my to-do list app. And so that's what translates. And that, in fact, is a good segue to part two. Usually for me, it's a Sunday night or maybe a Monday morning ritual that is now looking at the week ahead. So Saturday is reflective, looking backwards, whereas Sunday, Monday is now looking ahead. And there's a similar mindset. And we'll talk about OmniFocus because it kind of helps, in my opinion, it creates the weekly review ritual by walking you through your own list. But what I also try to do is a very intentional calendar preview. It's easy just to kind of look at your calendar in a broad sense and, all right, I'm busy every day, but I try to be more intentional, literally every single element of the calendar. All right, what do I need to be prepared for here? Is there advanced communication necessary? Do I need to read up on this, be ready to deliver that? So that is the first part. And then the second part is, using OmniFocus in my case, to walk through literally, it has a function that you kind of click through, which I like. And it, of course, reminds me of things that I need to do and or adjust to get ready for the week ahead.
What do you do in a week where you don't feel like either doing part one or part two? Just the willpower is at an all-time low, you're exhausted, you've been traveling, whatever. What do you do in those situations?
Yeah, it's a great question. I will defer it sometimes, but I find I really, and I don't know if this is the productivity nerd in me, the Saturday morning is a ritual I genuinely look forward to, even if it's been a long week. And sometimes, especially if it's been a long, hard week, that kind of private time, that personal time to reflect Saturday morning, I find myself like, I can't wait to get to Saturday morning because I've got a lot to load out of my head into the journal. Ideas occur to me. In fact, what I do, Mike, is I keep amongst the OmniFocus to-do items is put this down for Saturday morning. In other words, this is an idea I want to unpack, but I don't want to lose it. And so I make a note, and then Saturday morning, I go to that entry and say, all right, oh yeah, I need to think about, maybe I should start a podcast. As an example, you and I both appreciate, but podcasting was something that was a result of kind of Saturday morning creative time. And I kept working through it, and then, all right, let's do it. And so, but to your question, yes, sometimes if I just don't have the energy or I'm traveling, but I seldom cancel it because, again, for me, it is restorative. And so I do it on the road, I'll do it wherever, because it just has had that kind of value for me.
And I found too, a weekly review, it's kind of like physical exercise. I might not necessarily want to do it, but I want to do it more than the feeling of not having done it, because I know
Great way to put it.
That's going to track me during the week. Let's say you're at the coffee shop, it's a Saturday morning, you're going through maybe meeting notes or whatever, and just miscellaneous stuff, and you realize, okay, that's an open loop. So what do we do? What do you do with those open loops? Do those go right into OmniFocus, or do you rewrite them in a cleaner space? What does that look like for you?
Yeah, typically it is an OmniFocus reminder if it is an actual kind of tactical item. Sometimes, though, it may generate an email or some sort of reflection. In other words, if it's targeted for a colleague, and I'm like, yeah, I need to make sure I close the loop with them. Okay. And so it sometimes leads to some kind of weekend activity that is specific. Usually it translates into a to-do list next week item. Sometimes it reminds me to seek out some more information. And again, speaking of productivity tools, I'm a big fan of Evernote, is my virtual file cabinet. So a lot of times I'll be reminded, oh yeah, someone told me about a great resource on the web. I'll go find it, get that link, and stick it in Evernote. And I try to keep Evernote organized by different topics, as well as, of course, clients and associations I'm part of. But that is, your question's a good one, because often the open loops require a little bit of research. In fact, I'll make notes to myself. I'll hear, gosh, I hear Mike St. Pierre's got a great podcast. I need to go check, but I don't have time maybe during the week, but maybe it is Saturday morning that I'm going to search your website, figure out what's going on, and, make sure I capture it so I don't lose it, weeks later.
So we're going deeper into Nerdville here, but let's say you've taken an open loop, you've perhaps, most likely put it into OmniFocus, but let's say it's an item that you have to follow up on it. So as an example, you send in, maybe one of your follow-ups is send an email to Debbie about X, Y, or Z, but it's so important that you really can't rest until you either get a response or some resolution. So will you put an item on your calendar, follow up with Debbie? Will you use your email application to, and it's a little bit of pixel spyware, language here, but how do you track those things that you must be able to close the loop on? You have to get a response. You don't have the luxury of Debbie blowing it off or not following up with it.
That's a great question. Of course, I'm sensitive to bombing somebody else's inbox on a Saturday morning, although I'm guilty of doing that sometimes. Hopefully, though, I preface the email with, hey, you don't worry about this weekend, but I needed to, in my head, get it off my plate and make sure it's there for them when they're ready. Mike, what I've found most helpful for me is the use of audio files, voice notes. And I think some of my colleagues may love them or not like them as much because they have to hear my voice. But I find that there's something about being able to provide the verbal context of something. So if Debbie was the person that, as you mentioned, sometimes what I'll do a lot of times Saturday morning is just kind of hit people with some voice. Like, hey, Debbie, hope you're having a great weekend. And I'll put in the subject line, listen at your convenience, or not urgent. But it allows me, while it's fresh, to provide the context. And often it could be, and I sent you an email with the file, so you'll understand what I'm getting to. But yeah, I have a hard time. You're right. Some of these things are just, I need to deal with it. And so while I have the time and the mental space to do so, I'll use a combination of an email and a voice note to hopefully provide clarity. So when that person's ready to go, they'll have what they need.
Okay. Let's pivot, talk about OmniFocus. It's a very, very powerful application. I use it. It's got a number of great features that I wish other companies would replicate, such as the review. I just think that's absolutely brilliant. What is it about OmniFocus that feels right for you?
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. The review is probably the most important feature for me. Of course, it has the fundamental to-do list items. I don't fully utilize all the contextual variations that OmniFocus allows. I'm using primarily the different organizational, first by project, and then I subdivide projects into multiple categories. So just all my clients is a subcategory, but I've got other initiatives, the podcast, or activities, projects, and programs. So fundamentally, of course, the due date calendaring feature is huge, because those activities, you visually can see what's piling up on you. And so even before the weekly review, it allows me quickly to scan. Wow, I've got 27 things that I said I was going to do by Thursday. There's no way. And so it's a constant. In fact, my morning ritual, is a variation of the weekly ritual, which is first thing in the morning. I let OmniFocus prompt me, one, to do some daily affirmations, which again is something you don't have to have your app do for you, but I like it. It pops up 6 a.m. every morning. And so I have to read that. And it gives me that sense of closure, I suppose, in starting each day. By the way, I also use OmniFocus for other kind of ritual type items, the weekly review of certain goals. I have plugged in quarterly reviews and even annual reviews, which, by the way, by having them in the system, because you're driving in your car and you think, oh yeah, I need to add that to my quarterly review. Bingo, OmniFocus has allowed me to do that. But those, I guess, fundamentally, I was trying to
Mhm.
think, there was something else I was going to share with you. I also have kind of creative categories in OmniFocus that are non-dated or non-deadline oriented. But the weekly review, as you know, kind of forces me to review them on a semi-regular basis.
Mhm.
For example, blog posts that I want to write, just ideas for content
Mhm.
creation, which
Mhm.
don't have an absolute deadline. But again, for me, OmniFocus allows me to keep track of those dated items as well as those less kind of specific date oriented, but still helpful to keep together.
The second leg of the productivity stool is often considered to be calendaring. So what do you use for a calendar? Are you a Google Calendar person, Apple Calendar person, Fantastical? And what would you say are some best practices related to the use of digital calendar?
Yeah, great point. As a small firm, we use Google Calendar, which of course allows for the coordination of my 6 colleagues and myself, so we can keep track of things that are, collectively important and all that. I just a big believer in calendar coordination. A few things for me are fundamentals. One is allowing deep work time each week. So among my rituals and looking ahead at the week is making sure, one, that I plug in some of those personal things like exercise. I literally put it on the calendar. It doesn't always work, but at least it's thoughtful, or at least intentional.
Mhm.
Deep work, as you know, are kind of respect for Cal Newport and the opportunities sometimes that are shrinking on our calendars to actually think and
Mhm.
do creative activity. I'm trying, and I haven't got there yet, Mike, but I'm trying to be more intentional about time blocking the week, protecting Mondays and Fridays. I find Monday is when I like to do some of my own internal kind of planning, team meetings, interaction with my colleagues. Friday, I'm trying to preserve for more creative work,
Mhm.
writing, sometimes podcasting, and then put most of my meeting activity in the middle of the week, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, but also blocking the day. And
Mhm.
so again, to your question about, for me, best practice has been always putting a little bit of time in the morning, and I'm an early riser, so it typically doesn't compete with meetings, but making sure there is some time to get the day started, as opposed to, as you said, some of our colleagues that just kind of show up at work and the day kind of steamrolls them.
Yeah.
I make sure I've got at least an hour before any meeting happens. So
Mhm.
it's the 7 o'clock hour that
Mhm.
I'm doing that. But from a technology standpoint, again, for me, it's the Google Calendar, which of course, can translate across all devices.
I think too, sometimes just because somebody wants a meeting with you doesn't mean you have to grant them a meeting. And
So true.
we're in the nonprofit world, so we like to make people happy. We like to serve people, and it's not easy to say no. But maybe a counter to that is maybe a slight redirect, like, I'm happy to do a meeting, but before we do that, could you answer a few questions? And maybe through that process, you'll realize maybe you don't need a meeting, so that's interesting. What do you do when somebody says, hey, Patton, can I just, schedule a brief call with you? I just need 10 minutes. And it's really going to be 30 minutes. And that it's taking up headspace in your mind, but also it's taking time literally out of your day. What does Patton do in that kind of a situation?
Yeah, I'm thoughtful, because you're right. You and I both, we want to help people, and generally a request like that is often someone is in transition in the nonprofit world. Sadly, there's a lot of transition in this space. So I get a lot of calls like that, and I can already tell this is like they're about to resign, quit, leave. They're pondering a new opportunity, something like that. So I want to help. What I try to do, however, is one, bundle calls together. Kind of what is it? The context switching. For me, if I can keep calls together, I don't, in other words, want to insert a phone call in the middle of my Friday morning deep work
Mhm,
time,
mhm,
right? So I can kind of look at my calendar and say, all right, Tuesday afternoon, I've got 3 other calls scheduled. I'll put them there, and I like to then do back to back to back. Other times, given the nature of travel that I have to do, I'll look for driving time, because that's obviously I'm in the car and I've got a couple hours driving from here to there.
Mhm.
Maybe we'll try to steer that type of request to a time like that when I can, in fact, have the conversation. But in the old days, yeah, I might just react, okay, look at for the first available time. But now I'm stepping back and saying, no, not the first available time. Let's find the ideal time for that kind of request. And then generally I'll try to make it happen.
When you're in one of those calls, at say a desk, where you have some, space to write or you're typing, do you have Evernote open and you're taking notes, or is it just simply a scratch pad? What does that look like?
Yeah, great question. Scratch pad. I toyed with a Rocketbook, and I'm fascinated by the digital possibilities of using some sort of device or app like that. But for me, it is still typically pen to paper, and then sometimes I will type it into Evernote to capture it more effectively. Sometimes I'll leave myself a voice note, and I can listen to it later. Often I'm then scanning, literally just taking a scan of my handwritten notes and sticking it in the appropriate folder. Of course, that is subject to me being able to read my notes later, right, when I go back into Evernote. So, but I try to, at least before I scan, circle things or add some additional notes, because I have in fact made that mistake of 6 months later. I'm like, I don't know what I said there. I can't read my handwriting, or I'm not sure exactly what it meant. But again, I still find pen to paper is my go-to. I'm sitting at a meeting. I have a hard time, pulling up my laptop in front of someone. So it tends to be handwritten.
Same here. And the beauty of Evernote is it reads everything you write. And so you can do a quick search later, provided Evernote can decipher your handwriting.
Can decipher it.
For
Yeah,
me,
right.
sometimes it cannot. I want to start to land the plane. And it seems like one of the themes of our whole conversation today as part of this year's summit is being intentional. And your book, which we'll make sure we put in the show notes, does such a good job, I think, of inviting nonprofit leaders to be intentional. And one of the things you talk about is making a professional personal retreat, taking some time to get away. It doesn't have to be fancy, but get out of the office, whether you work at home or you're in a traditional space, get away from there to a place where it's a little more calm, where you can think, where you can just breathe, where you can be alone. And I'd love for you to tell those who'll be participating this year's summit, what does that look like? And why would a professional personal retreat be valuable?
Yeah, I'm delighted at that question. And it hit me years ago that we as professionals spend a ton of time likely in retreats for our organizations. And yet we don't spend anywhere near proportionally the strategic time considering our own professional personal path. And thus I was running in more and more people that were like, I like my work, but I'm just not sure where I'm going to go from here. These kind of vague, and I felt for them, sympathetic to that. And I'm like, well, maybe the same principles that applied to that strategic planning retreat you did with your nonprofit would apply to you personally. And so, as you suggested in the book, I've kind of broken it down into 4 phases, using the same techniques we use for our businesses or nonprofits. And so phase 1 is when you're about to do a retreat, as many of you watching or listening have done, sometimes your boss will give you a book to read. Let's everybody on the leadership team read this book. Well, I do the same thing. As I do my annual retreat personally, I will look at some of the recommendations I've gotten over the last year and say, all right, that one gets me excited. I'm going to make an intentional effort. What I call a clear your head book. It could be Viktor Frankl's, In Search of Meaning or whatever, Man's Search for Meaning, right? And those kind of books that are deeply thoughtful and less tactical. What you and I, of course, like, both tactical, but sometimes you need a clear your head kind of book. I'll identify podcasts, long forms that I want to listen to, because as you said, I do think a principle of a personal retreat is getting out of your current space. And I know there are limitations to what people can do, but I feel like most of us have a friend or a family member that has a cabin or a space, or just going out of town. And maybe it's staying in a hotel and a couple extra nights around an existing trip. But the point is, as you said, I do think there's value in getting out of your current space. It just creates a different mindset. So that travel allows for the listen to the podcast or listen to the long form audio book. Hopefully you've done some reading to clear your head. And then the 3 phases of the retreat itself will be familiar to every one of you that have been through a retreat. The first exercise I do, let's say you travel up to your retreat on a Friday afternoon, get settled. So Saturday morning, the first exercise is a visioning exercise. And I look at my own personal strategic plan and, 3 or 4 categories: personal development, spiritual, emotional, financial, educational, and then like what I call enterprise. So as a small business, and each of these areas, I think about, all right, what does best case look like 5 years from now? So visioning exercise, just like you've done again with your organization, do it for yourself. Then I move to phase 2, which is self-assessment. And I've created, and as you know in the book, kind of think about, there are 10 categories of skills and experience that I'm always trying to work on. So every year I pull out the 10 skills and experiences and then do a self-evaluation. All right, how am I doing here? What can I do to get better? Which leads then to the third and final part, which is goal setting. And so typically for me, while there's 5-year visioning, there's the self-assessment, let's say Saturday afternoon, and then maybe Sunday morning before I go home. All right, what am I going to do this year? And so I'll do, annually, what do I need to do to move in all of my closer to my 5-year vision? And then try to be very intentional then about tactics that have deadlines. Between now and December 31, I need to do this and give myself things to track. So again, thank you for asking about it. But I hope the spirit that I want to convey to folks is, I'm just convinced people do not invest that kind of quality time in themselves. And I wonder if it wouldn't be helpful for those that are just like feeling burned out, feeling like they don't have direction, and maybe some time like what I described would be helpful.
So be honest, when you come back, is your staff dreading, here comes Patton back from his retreat?
Yes, that is such a good point. Yes. They're like, man, we can't keep up with all the stuff we have on our to-do list now, and you're going to add 3 more. So I try to be sensitive. And of course, what I also try to do is have activities with my team. So there is another retreat, if you will, that is more collective. And so my personal retreat often will inform a team retreat. And I'm careful not to just because I have lots of ideas, it doesn't mean I should punish them with too many of theirs. But I may come back and say, there are 3 things I'd love to design our next retreat around, and get your feedback. And often the feedback is an appropriate pushback. That's a good idea, maybe, but not now.
Yeah, sign of a good team.
And so, right, because and you raise another point I forgot to mention in my weekly ritual, and maybe in this annual ritual context, is I'm trying to be more intentional, not just looking at my calendar for the week ahead, but each of my colleagues. What's Lee got this week? What's Lauren got this week? What's Adam got this week? Because it's easy for me to be tunnel focused on my calendar, but they have important things going on too, and that often changes the direction slightly of my thinking, because I'm like, yeah, maybe I need to put something on the back burner of mine because my colleague needs help, and that's frankly more important.
It's easy to forget that we are supervisors and workers, and I think a lot of times,
Great point.
in terms of productivity, it's like, I got my things to do today. I'm rocking and rolling. I'm optimized for success. And then it's like, oh, right. Yeah, I'm also a supervisor. I'm also an executive director. And those might be different skills where it's just shut up and listen and make the phone call and just be there for the people who report to you.
Mike, I love that. And to reveal among the daily affirmations that pops into my OmniFocus inbox is, hey, are you being a good husband? Are you being a good parent? Yeah, I got 3 kids. And then are you being a good leader of your team? Because that is why I think it's so important to start each day, because often it's easy to get lost in our own world. And that reminds me literally on a daily basis that, yeah, I also need to be a good, parent, husband, colleague, and be intentional accordingly.
Patton, really grateful for your time. How can folks find out more about you and about PMA?
Well, thank you. PattonMcDowell.com is the website. Patton McDowell and all of the kind of social media platforms. I'm most active on LinkedIn. And then the other phrase that someone might look up is Your Path to Nonprofit Leadership. That will take them to the podcast and the book, both of which are titled Your Path to Nonprofit Leadership. So grateful for this opportunity, Mike, and would be happy to engage with anyone like you and I that wants to talk productivity or anything related to nonprofit leadership.
Thanks, Patton.